Hey everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. In today's video we're actually going to be taking a look at two different knives from the same maker, and the maker in question is Mr. Les George, who is a custom knife maker of certainly some acclaim within the community. So two models here. We have the VECP, also commonly known as the VECP, and then we have a production piece that he did in collaboration with Florian Knives, and we'll talk about kind of both of these differences, some of the interesting, I guess, thought or movements that have occurred as a result of this knife. But let's go ahead and start off with the what I call the VECP, but I was corrected as actually the VECP. So let's do a little bit of intro first before I jump into the specs. So Mr. Les George was in the armed forces. He did quite a bit of work in the EOD department, which is the explosive ordnance disposal, and that's really where a lot of his utility and functionality and design work draws from. I believe all of his models derive their names from different, I guess, tools or explosives or other things within that work, such as the VECP here. There's also the Rockeye, which is the custom version of this knife, which is what this is based on. I believe he said it was some type of cluster bomb or something along those lines. But, you know, that's certainly where he draws a lot of his, I guess, design prowess, or at least naming the knives. So this is what we would call a mid-tech, and this really was kind of the first knife to popularize the concept of mid-techs, at least under that name. So as many of you may recall, the term mid-tech was really, I guess, developed by Ken Onion, but due to the success that I know this model has had among collectors, a lot of other knife makers wanted to try their hand at a mid-tech as well. So one thing that Mr. George did say was that in regard to a mid-tech, by his own definition, there needs to be kind of a bottleneck in the process, and that should be the custom maker. So all of these go through his hands before they're sold, and so he said if there's any problem with quality, fit and finish, any of those things, it really falls on him as the maker, since he is ensuring that these are well built and functioning properly. So, and I think that's a great way to kind of standardize that definition. He did want to say, though, that you know, while he might have kind of popularized the concept of mid-tech, he did say that Rick Hinderer and his knives, as well as Strider, have been doing the same thing for quite some time. They simply never called them mid-techs, they referred to them as production knives. So that was kind of his take on this subject, which was really cool. So some of his projects that he's done, obviously this one is quite well known, continues to sell very, very well. He just had one collaboration, the ZT900 with Kai USA, and he should have other models coming out with under the zero tolerance line in the future. And then Florian Knives was another collaboration that he did. So we'll talk about this in a minute. But let's get into the specs now that we've kind of introduced a few interesting details, I think, in that regard. But again, certainly a well-known knife among knife enthusiasts. Everyone has at least seen or heard of this knife that I'm aware of, although not everyone's probably handled it. But spec-wise, looking at a handle length here of 4.7 inches, blade length of 3.5 inches, and then the thickness of the knife is about 0.49 inches. So titanium frame lock, thumb stud model. You know, as far as my overall impressions, I wasn't terribly excited with this knife initially, but this is a knife that really grows on you in use. Every detail is well thought out. The detent is perfectly optimized to flick it out with authority and have a nice, sure deployment of the knife. No stick whatsoever. All the edges are nicely contoured. The cutout here works well to access the thumb stud. It also gives you a great spot for your first finger to lock in, which instills confidence in the grip. You know, stonewash finish, kind of a no frills, straightforward type of knife. And again, it's been very, very popular and continues to be so, even though there are so many other mid-techs out there these days. So pocket clip is absolutely exceptional. great retention. It just slides in and out of the pocket, no problems whatsoever. Uses his own hardware, I believe, but this is the third iteration. Some of the changes that have been made were through the different iterations were he made the thread smaller on the pivot for easier disassembly and assembly. The thumb stud has been moved down a tiny bit, which helped to improve the deployment on the knife. So those are just some of the different things that have occurred with this particular knife. Really cool back spacer, but yeah, just really kind of just, it's a no-nonsense, well-built knife. And you know, it's grown on me quite a bit, even though it's not as exciting necessarily as something with Damascus, Mokutai, flippers, bearings, all those things. This is just kind of a workhorse. So yeah, so that's kind of where we're looking at with this. Now let's take a look at a collaboration that he did with a knife company, or more like a manufacturer, or I guess steel processor. I'm not quite sure what the correct definition would be, but Florian Knives is a collaboration that I guess Florian did with Mr. Les George. They primarily produce garden equipment, shears, other tools for use in the garden, and they're also one of the only, I think, OEM manufacturers that does a hollow grind in the United States. I believe that's what Mr. George said. So of course this one does have a hollow grind versus the flat grind of the VECP there. But you know, cool knife. It certainly carries the Les George design language without question. Let's talk about the specs real quick. So blade length of about 3.4 inches, handle length of about 4.9, handle thickness of about 0.44 inches, and then weighs in at 5.05 ounces. So, you know, some of the differences: the thickness of this one is 0.44 inches, thickness of this one is 0.49 inches. This weighs in at 5.65 ounces, this weighs in at 5.05 ounces. So, you know, a little bit longer, a little bit thinner. Both have good ergonomics, but you know, this one has a little bit more thickness, and there's more work that has gone into this one. You know, for instance, the really nice kind of like a polished stone wash finish versus just kind of a heavier stone wash. Better rounded edges, if that makes sense, just a little more contoured on the scales there. Better pocket clip for sure. This is kind of an off-the-shelf pocket clip, and I do want to clarify that this is, I believe, version 1, and I know that he mentioned there were at least 2 versions, possibly 3. I think I missed that detail in our conversation, but this uses off-the-shelf pivot and thumb studs, and the version 2 did get upgraded to, I guess, his own proprietary pivot, or ones that he uses or produces, and then the thumb studs were upgraded to tip. On the version 2, it actually has asymmetric thumb studs, so one side is shorter than the other. Oddly enough, with this knife, it has quite large, quite long thumb studs, and this knife, I've actually kind of waved it out of my pocket once or twice because this thumb stud grabs onto the edge of my pocket and pulls the blade out. So the version 2 addressed that by giving you one side that's longer and one side that's shorter, and you can switch them, so if you're left or right-handed, you have the longer side on whatever your dominant thumb is, essentially. So those were some of the changes between the first version, which I have here, and then the second version. So yeah, but again, the same design language, nice hollow grind, kind of a no-nonsense knife, not quite as smooth, but still very smooth. Pretty good ergonomics. Jimping's a little bit sharper, which I generally prefer. Pocket clip works well, but you know, this is definitely an off-the-shelf titanium clip here. So yeah, so just looking at some of the differences between the two. Yeah. Now, Florian Knives has done a few other collaborations. I know there was a Mike Draper one. I think there was another one as well, but you won't see any more collaborations. Mr. George just said it required more time than he had anticipated, and so they just did the 2 versions of this knife, which is the Kona, which was the name or the model designation for this particular one. So anyways, just want to give you guys a look at that. I had been curious about both of these knives, and again, luckily my friend Pat, who's let me borrow these, had both on hand, so he was kind enough to send them to me. But there are certainly price point differences. I think this one is in like, I want to say around the $300 mark. Unfortunately, I've forgotten at this very moment, and this one's closer to the $400 mark. So, you know, you do get more with this knife, and certainly going through the maker's hands is worth something as well, which is why all of these have been so, you know, so well put together, and zero quality issues whatsoever that I've heard of. So anyways, that's pretty much it. The VECP did start out in 2010. It seems to still be going strong. And as far as other projects go, again, there's more coming with ZT, but he also has a new collaborative project with Chad Nichols. And as many of you know, Chad Nichols has his own manufacturing capabilities, and he has produced many of the mid-techs that are out there right now. The difference with his collaboration with Mr. Les George is that they put a tremendously more amount of, they put way more machine time into the knives under the Defiant 7 series, which is what the project is called. And so you get some really interesting handle work and machine work, you know, than his other mid-techs that he did with custom makers. And Mr. George said the reason is because they don't have to charge for the machine time by the hour or minute, whatever metric they use. They simply eat some of the cost of the machine work that goes into the Defiant 7. And if you guys take a look, you know, all the major retailers seem to be picking them up, but I think you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. So yeah, so anyways, that was just a look at 2 knives, you know, one a mid-tech, one a production. Hopefully you were able to glean some of the differences. We talked about the maker Les George a little bit. And yeah, comments or questions, let me know. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm not even sure how it went. I'm going to have to watch it and see what I said. But thanks so much for tuning in. Appreciate you guys watching and thumbing up my videos. So I'll see you guys on the next one pretty soon. Take care.